Um, I'm John Muir Laws. I am a nature journaler from California, and have been teaching nature journaling since shortly after I got out of college. I realized it was the first time I started sort of experimenting with nature journaling and how to teach it when I was working at a residential outdoor school in California. I am joined today by the amazing Ivea Moore, the mad botanist. Do you want to introduce yourself to the crew? We've got some new folks today.
Sure thing. Lovely to see you all or to meet you. My name is Ivea Moore from San Francisco. Um, just a member of the community, sometimes educator, sometimes I teach about plants, random teacher of gardening classes to preschoolers, and whoever else enjoys environmental education, and so delighted to be here with all of you.
Delighted to be here with you too, Ivea. I'm just going to modify your intro by removing the just does,
Okay.
because whatever space you step into, you make a beautiful space. Also with us today, the amazing, the fantastic, the now red-haired Billy Joe Reed. Um, Billy Joe.
Hi, everyone. How are you today? I'm Billy Joe Reed. I live in Ontario, Canada, in a small little town called Orangeville. I am a part of the nature journaling community and work as an outdoor educator in my other times of life. And I'm super happy to be here, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Great. So we're your hosts together. We work together to try to keep the conversations kind, respectful. Our only rules as we're talking about things is that everybody is respectful and kind. So if you do that, you make our job really, really easy. Um, in that, we also have had a chance to have some really, really in-depth, interesting conversations about topics that are very relevant to education and critical thinking and nature journaling, and today is going to be one of those. I have been working for a little while on trying to develop some resources on how to teach people when you get a question, what do you do with that question, right? So, one thing like people do is like, well, you can look it up, Google it, right? Which is fine to do. But if we're actually trying to figure stuff out by our own observations, um, getting ourselves or our students to use the process of science, um, there are strategies and structures that are really useful to use, and um, generally speaking, those approaches I don't think are taught very well or made really clear. And so I have been kind of going around on a circuit to the Exploratorium, Academy of Sciences. A bunch of different organizations have had me kind of do some teacher education things with them. I did a presentation at what used to be the California Science Teachers Association, now is California Association of Science Educators, at a case conference presenting these materials. And what it is, I think, is a missing piece in how we go about thinking about the structure of scientific investigation. And if you have this piece in place, it makes it a lot easier. So some of you have actually heard me present on this before. My general idea has been that there are three types of questions. There are let's see questions that you can answer through direct observation. There are could it be questions that you can answer through inference. And there are let it be questions for which you can neither use direct observation nor inference. And those are questions that are interesting and beautiful and meaningful and profound, but just outside of the realm and the scope of science. So that is how I've been teaching things. And recently I put that information of, again, let's see, direct observation. Could it be is inference. So if you can't directly observe something, but you say, like, if that were true, what would I expect to see, right? Then you're using inference. And the let it be's. So I've been teaching that, but I decided, what if I present this information in a different format, just so that people would have a different way of seeing it. And I put it in a flowchart pattern. And as I was doing it, it made me think about it in a different way. And I found the exercise really useful. And I've also found it useful in teaching. So I wanted to share it with you. If you like the way it is, everything that I think of is open source. So feel free to take and use this stuff as you see fit, right? But I thought that by bringing it in front of this community, we could workshop it and make it better. We could figure out how to make this way of describing this process even more clear. And so, I want to share that with you. So what I'd like to do with you is to take you through the flowchart of let's see, could it be, and let it be. And then see if there's any thoughts or ideas of how to make it better. And if there aren't, then we are then it's up and open for anybody to use if you want to. I just need to find my little notebook because I want to take notes, and here I am without my notebook. So I am going to instead grab a piece of paper, and I want to suggest you might want to kind of sketch note along with this as we go, or not. But I think this should be fun. Before we get going, I'm going to just bounce over to the gallery view and find out if there are any initial questions that people have, or so we can see Susan's kitty cat. Meow. Oh, that's nice. Or does anybody have any community announcements that they wanted to make? I probably should have given people an opportunity to do that earlier on. So either any questions about what I've said so far, or community announcements. And Avea.
I thought I could quickly bring up some community announcements. So folks know Marley's season 3 of the Nature Journal show begins tonight. I believe tonight's about hummingbirds at the feeder. But so folks know, he has already left San Diego. He arrived in Panama, I think last night or maybe the night before. But last I heard he was on a bus going to Panama. So that's where he is now. He is safe and sound. And so his show continues. Season 3 has already begun. Tomorrow, we will be continuing our Africa series with Jack at 10, and it will be about Bovine versus Antilopine. I can't think if I'm thinking the right name.
Actually, I'm going to expand it to sort of general artiodactyl fun.
Okay, so cloven-hooved beasties, or even-toed ungulates. Is what we mean when we say artiodactyla. So that will be tomorrow.
And throw in the whales. Why not?
Exactly. Yeah, fun fact, whales also qualify as this. They're also artiodactyls. That's fun. So that'll be tomorrow at 10. And I'll be trying to get that video up ASAP. For folks who are heading to Tanzania, there is a playlist on Jack's YouTube channel called Africa Series, so that you can look at them and find them all in one nice, neat little package whenever you need. Also, Pencil, Mouse, and Chill will be at its usual 8 tomorrow and its usual 3 on Saturday. I can't think of other things. I'm sure that there's more going on. Just welcome to 2023. A reminder to, if you were able to schedule kindness for yourself during the holidays, keep it up. And if not, it is never too late to schedule kindness for yourselves. And if I can think of anything else, I'll put it into the chat. It looks like the community calendar is still on Jack's website for now. I'm not sure when it's going going to transition. I know myself and one other person are having trouble adding their dates. So we're going to get in touch with the kind folks over at the Wild Wonder Foundation's new website. But if you start to not see the calendar on Jack's page, go check there. And that is all. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Avea. So we have, I'm gonna, this presentation I'm showing you, is part of a larger presentation that I do, where I introduce I notice, I wonder, it reminds me, not me, I notice, I don't reminds the, let's see, could it be, and let it be's. I am going to share my screen and bring up Keynote here. And I'm going to make a few adjustments on my end to hide the video panel and hide floating meeting controls. Okay, there you go. So this was part of a kind of a larger presentation where I introduced people to Let's See, and kind of the idea that you kind of systematically make observations and then you learn something about something. And then I kind of went into could it be, in contrast that, like, looking at why do the robins migrate? You can't directly observe this, and people came up with alternate hypotheses, and there's a discussion about that, and how you go about if you make a prediction and you see it or you don't, what does that mean? And then I kind of got into let it be's, and so they've already kind of had seen this format, and this was the review, and so here's where the flow chart starts. So it starts with a question about a phenomenon, and this, I think, is useful to articulate, because a phenomenon, if you're, it's something that is something that's observable in the natural world, and things that aren't observable are part of the natural world. Science can't really play in those pools. Science is not useful for the supernatural. So anything that is outside of nature that we cannot measure, quantify, observe, we can't really explore using science. So there's a phenomenon that is an observable phenomenon. And let me bring up this. All right, so here we go. So there's where we start. And then here's the let's see process. So can an answer be directly observed? So if you're wondering, when will it start to rain? You keep looking out your window next to the clock, and you can observe, you can directly observe this. What is the size of hailstones in this hail event we're having? You can go out, you can measure them. So you can observe, you can measure, and just things that are important for people to keep in mind as they're doing this. One is their bias. So bias is, am I collecting observations in a way that perhaps is easier for me to collect information, but may kind of skew my results. The old joke about the person goes into a parking lot and at night, and there's a person underneath the light post there looking around on the ground. And they say, what are you looking for? And the person says, oh man, I lost my car keys. And then the next question is, wow, so sorry, buddy, where'd you lose your car keys? Well, way over there on the other side of the lot. Well, why are you looking here? And the person says, well, this is where the light is. So sometimes there will be, data of convenience that may be easy for us to collect, but collecting that data gives us only a skewed sample. We end up only talking to our friends who are urban people who live in California. And that's a biased sample. The other thing to think about is the size of your sample. Small numbers can yield, are much more likely to yield, give us false information. I just ask a few people a question and um, sort of wingnut ideas that those people have will skew. Like 50% of the people thought this. Oh my gosh, how many people did you talk to? Two. Oh, you mean one of those two people had this idea? Well, let's talk to a few more people. So sample size and bias are things that you want to observe, to think about when you're doing this. And so from these observations, we use the process of induction to draw provisionary conclusions based on the strength of the evidence. So the conclusions that we draw, you know, if I don't have a very large sample, or even if I know that my sample has bias in it, I can say, like, you know, I only talked to, you know, people who were leaving the stadium early about how the show was because I wanted to get home and it was cold. If you want to be aware of that and let those factors temper the strength of the claim that you make. That's also, interestingly, it's something that is being discussed in this book, which I recommend to everybody, The Psychology of Intelligence Analysis. This is currently our book for our Nature Journal book club. First meeting was yesterday. But this whole idea of kind of keeping track of, you know, how sure are you about that? Rather than just have information be yes, no. That's important. So, and what's, so you're looking at evidence and you're drawing conclusions from that. That is the process of induction. Well, something that's kind of fun about that here is just sort of a side note that that's what Sherlock Holmes did, right? But when you think about Sherlock Holmes, do you usually think of deduction or induction? We think of deduction, right? But it turns out that what Sherlock Holmes does is induction. But for some reason, you know, therefore I deduce. There's a lot of saying deduce when you mean induce. So induce means from, I'm going to get all these little clues out there by observing the world, and I'm going to draw conclusions from that. I'm going to induce them from all of those. So that's induction, and this is so things I like in here. I've got that the conclusions are provisionary conclusions, so I'm willing to change my mind on those given other evidence. I like having the bias and sample size there. So that's first part of that's my kind of review of the kind of key points of let's see, and I put some of those in bold. But let's say the answer can't be directly observed, right? This is where I get into the could it be's. And so, so can the answer be directly observed? Yes, then you directly observe it. No. The next question is, can you think of possible plausible explanations or hypotheses for the phenomenon that you're seeing? Like, well, could it be caused by this? Could it be caused by this? Could it be caused by this? Right? And that's why I call this category, the whole category, could it be? So rather than calling it the you know, the hypothetical deductive method or something like that, which confuses everybody, I call this the category, the could it be's. So here's where deduction comes in. So the idea with deduction is where you're saying, if this is true, I would expect to see this and this and this and this, right? And so from a general principle or a statement, I am creating possibilities. I'm creating these things that I would expect to see. And these are things that I either will observe or I won't. So if there's something that I should see, and I don't see that, that is going to make it my level of confidence in that phenomenon, or that explanation, much less, or less, depending on the strength of that test. So you create tests, and the idea is that you are trying to prove your explanation wrong. So this whole idea of falsification is really useful. If there is an explanation, but there is no way I could come up with a test that would falsify it, then that explanation is not testable. It is then not a scientifically useful explanation. And so the idea of these predictions that you make being testable is kind of a key point. So if you can make testable predictions, then you test those, and then you want to consider, are there any other possible explanations for this? So just because you tested something and you saw what would be predicted by that test doesn't mean that you're right. Because a lot of other things may have the same same symptom, the same effect. That prediction would also be made from could be made from other hypotheses. So you have to always consider what are the other hypotheses that are out there, and you also need to check your assumptions, because any one of these predictions, it is between the assumptions live as a little connector between explanations and predictions. That's where, so if these are explanations, these are predictions, the assumptions live between those. And they say, here's my explanation. Like, if these things are true, then this, right? So check your assumptions. And then remember, before we induced provisionary conclusions, we now are going to infer provisionary explanations. Provisionary because if we get other evidence to the contrary, we're going to still allow ourselves to change our minds. And so that's my could it be. But there are going to be some cases where it cannot be directly observed, and you cannot think of testable explanations, right? This whole area, these could it be's and these let's see, this is the purview of science. So science plays in this zone of observation and inference. But if it cannot be directly observed, and it doesn't produce any testable predictions, then we've got the last category. And that's my let it be. So hold on a second. So if you cannot create plausible explanations or directly observe, you are outside of the realm of science. And if the predictions that you make from this are not falsifiable, testable predictions, they're not falsifiable, then this is also, that explanation is outside of the realm of science. And that's where we explore it with poetry, story, philosophy, or spirituality. And that is my flowchart. And so I found it kind of useful to kind of put it out there. It feels there's something more that I want here, and I don't know what it is. And that's why I wanted to turn to the A team. That's you. and and for us um, to do this. So Eleni has got a raised hand. Why don't I stop this share and let's jump over to um, our so Eleni. Hey there.
Greetings. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year to you.
So it's just great to see everybody. So I love this. I love this flow chart, and I really appreciate your making it so that it gives us a container to have this great discussion. So I have one point about the let it be section that's outside of the realm of science. I got to thinking that, yes, poetry, story, philosophy, spirituality, and those in that arena where people are telling stories, those stories can also then generate the let's see, can it be directly observed? So I think that I'm visualizing a loop so that we have the let's see, we take that as far as it goes. We have the could it be using inference and taking that as far as it goes. And then we get into this other place. And I think that other place counterintuitively can lead us back.
So explain the route back to me, because it would be fun to sort of see that feedback in.
Okay, well, that's a great question. And I'll make one up. I'll make up a loop. So we have a story of the world being created in 7 days. So that's a story that we read about in the Abrahamic religions, that the world was created in 7 days. So that story is kind of compelling. So can we test whether it's been created in 7 days? And we can, and we learn that no, it was more than 7 days. And so then we might want to ask other questions about that story. Well, the story has the order of things that were appearing on the earth. Can we test that order? And we might interrogate that story, which doesn't diminish the story, but it gives us a kind of doorway into thinking about that story as a different kind of evidence. Something like that. I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's what comes to mind.
I see what you're saying. Let me try to repeat that back to you to see if I'm understanding correctly. And when we talk about this, we do have to be careful, because when we talk about something such as the claim that the Earth is created in 7 days, or 6 days with 1 day for rest, for many people, that is tied directly to their spirituality and sense of identity. And when we talk about those things, the conversation can get very threatening very fast.
Yes, that is true. It was maybe a bad example.
Well, no, but it's an example of the sort of things you're talking about. So where does this fit in on that?
Yeah.
So what there's also different versions of the Earth is created in 7 days, and for some people that's metaphorical.
Right.
For other people it is literal. There are ways of kind of approaching it on the literal side, where if you get data that is, one way is that if you get data that is counter to your explanation, then you assume that you did something wrong and need to come up with a different explanation. Another is to say that all of the things that you have been the things that you're looking at are planted as distractions from an evil force, a devil. And so that the fossils are there to trick you into not being a believer. Another is that we don't know the mind of this creative force. Who's to say that the creative force that made these things in 7 days could not have created all these strata and other sort of things in situ in that moment for whatever reasons they chose. Um, and the uh, if you take either of those, either the say the fossils are put in there by a devil,
Yeah.
or that they are put in there by a creator in 7 days, but that those um, but the whole pattern has the appearance of having been there for a long time. They just chose, for whatever their reasons are, to
Yeah.
create it that way.
Yeah.
Um, that then, it is an explanation, but it becomes, in the second step of the flowchart,
Yeah.
is it's testable and falsifiable. It
Yeah.
is not falsifiable
Right.
because those either of those claims are um, it's sort of like, if you've seen the movie The Matrix,
Yes. Yeah.
right? So, we're all in this world and it's all created in our brains by a computer. What evidence do we have besides the occasional deja vu event, right? To realize that we're not in the matrix. If the matrix system is good enough, it will be completely indistinguishable. And so we can't tell if we are. And so, like, the matrix hypothesis, the God that puts things in place with the appearance that they have been there for billions of years,
Yeah.
um, but really did create things, this world, within the last 10,000 years, but with the appearance that things are older, it becomes, again, an untestable explanation.
Yeah. Just a quick follow-up. I so appreciate what you said, and I realize in my enthusiasm, I jumped in with a sort of highest stakes kind of
Yeah.
crazy question. And but as a kind of place where I'm coming from, in my tradition, somehow we've made the ability to interrogate the story without diminishing it or disrespecting it. I'll just leave it at that,
Oh,
because the story has its own place. And Judaism is not the only religion that does this, that tries, to look at the stories next to science and not have them be contradictory. But maybe it's another version of this wonderful model that you've made, that at some point it's out of the realm of that story.
well, and also something that is interesting in your tradition, it's sort of built into the Judaic, my understanding, that built into this Judaic tradition is this practice of discussing it and kind of working around it and sort of thinking
Yep.
about it. And um, nobody's claiming I have the answer, and
Well,
that um, and because there will be another scholar who will say, "Mm, mm, 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 mm. Let's think about it this way." Um, so
there are questions, though. There are questions where, in Buddhism, that's not a useful question. And that would be the same as it's outside of the realm of science. And in Judaism, they would say there's certain questions that, don't have answers, and there's a list of them. So maybe what I'm thinking about, and I'll wrap up so there's others who want to speak, is that maybe the same model that you've given us does actually exist in other settings, even in this community setting that I'm familiar with. And so maybe that would be a good exercise for me to map that on, because I
yeah,
think you've really expanded this in such a great way.
yeah, I think you have figuring out when you have an untestable question. It's
Yeah.
okay to say that there are explanations that are just not testable.
Right.
And when you run into one of those,
Right. Right. And they have to be testable in such a way that it's not just, I think it's that way. So
right. So
Yeah.
so by testable, we're ultimately saying that you can find evidence against it.
yeah.
So, for instance, you cannot find any evidence against the matrix hypothesis, right? Because that you could just say, no, the machines are, well, that's one problem with a lot of conspiracies, conspiracy theories, is that there is no evidence for them. And then people will say, well, that just shows how deep the conspiracy goes.
Yeah.
But they've ultimately created an untestable, there's no evidence that would make them change their mind. So if there isn't any evidence that would make you change your mind, then you got to go like, okay, I'm not doing science. But it is okay so what both Stephen Jay Gould and the Catholic Church ascribe to is this idea of what they refer to as magisteria. And what that is it's a realm of knowledge and knowing things. And over here is the way of knowing things through science and observation. And over here is this way of knowing things through through your religious texts. And according to both John Paul II and Stephen Jay Gould, prominent evolutionary biologists, these magisteria are non-overlapping. That, but when they come to, if they were to come together and overlap, then that's where the problems are. And also the problems that kind of come from people saying that if you accept scientific explanations for phenomena, then you have to give up your religion and your spirituality. Both the Catholic Church are saying no, and the evolutionary biologists are saying, there are many evolutionary biologists, for instance, who are deeply spiritual religious believers, Catholics, Protestants, all sorts of other different religions. And they're just
Albert Einstein was very religious.
Yeah. So let's bring Susan
Yeah, thank you
into
for
this. This is cool because these get to things, you know, it's you know, the one reason I have this category of let it be, where it's just like science hands off, is that before, you know, I saw teachers kind of going like, you know, a kid would raise the, you know, the possibility of like, what if this was created, or a non-testable thing, and just to acknowledge that that's a beautiful question and a really interesting explanation. It's just not testable by science. So when we're doing science, we have to say like, I don't know, right? But we still want to give that room for exploring those things in other ways. Just that the specific tool of science isn't what we are using. I'm going to bring into this. Is it okay if I keep you on here a little bit more, Eleni?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Because I have another idea. Maybe I'll put it in the chat, but I'd love to hear
Okay.
what others have to say. Yeah.
All right. So I'm bringing Susan in here. I see Kate, Ivea, and Kate also have things to share in this. Susan, thank you for being with us.
Thanks. Yeah, this is great. Yeah, I had some thoughts that were not connected with what Eleni said, but first I was going to note, I think it sounds like there is some discussion. My initial sense of what Eleni was saying, and maybe you'll correct me, is that these questions that come from poetry, spirituality, all these things may sometimes lead us to other questions or inspire other questions or other explanations that we can approach by these other methods. And I've thought about that, and I'm like, that seems right to me. I'm struggling to come up with like an example historically of that, but that seems like I guess I understand the desire to keep these ideas separate from the standpoint of sometimes you're like an 8th grade science teacher and you have to cover these things and frankly, sometimes kids are primed, I think, by some folks who want there to be more of a controversy than there needs to be, I think, to have a big controversy that derails the whole science discussion. And so I understand the usefulness of treating these as separate things. I'm not sure that they necessarily always need to be, but now I'm going off into other tangents. I'm not even sure what to back up what I'm saying there. One thing I wanted to mention that's just in relation to this idea of stories as kind of that is that I just wanted to know this author, Ted Chiang, who if you may have heard of him, he wrote a novella called Story of Your Life that was the basis for the movie Arrival, which was made a few years ago, which is all about linguistics and how learning another language can change the way that you think. And all of his short stories, they're all, I would call it speculative fiction. It's not exactly fantasy, it's not exactly science fiction, it's speculative fiction. And they just about all of them start with some kind of premise of, but what if this thing was true? And that could be a totally fantasy thing that is definitely, one of them is all about like, what if all the weirdest Victorian era ideas about science were actually true? And then let's go from there, but, the story of your life is about, what if we take the idea that learning a new language can affect the way that you think, and let's turn that up to 11 and something like that. And he builds from this a really interesting, really moving story with interesting world building, and so it makes that a really interesting story. So I wanted to recommend that. And in particular, there's a story in this book where the sort of the premise is, it's a world just like our own, except that we have very clear, definite evidence, lots of different pieces of evidence that the world is about 6,000 years old, or at least that something significant changed 6,000 years ago, to which people therefore can, are basically saying, well, okay, so God created the world 6,000 years ago. But like trees, like you can look at fossilized trees or very old trees, and you can see a point where if you go far enough in, there's no longer tree rings.
Yeah.
And so it takes that premise, and then he kind of goes from there, and it's like, here's all the emotional consequences of this. Here's what will happen, in like exploring all that. So I wanted to recommend that because it's just very fascinating. So that was just do you mind if I don't want to take the conversation too far away from this, but I had a different comment about the flow chart.
No, that's great. This is all welcome.
Okay.
And it's also just interesting, like you're pointing out that story as a way of investigating a thought or an idea is, as a human endeavor, is a useful, interesting, productive way to do this. And I also saw in the notes on the side that Kate Ryder was mentioning that, also sometimes perhaps stories that are part of a tradition from our ancestors, have a place in this too. And those are different than that's different than our direct observation or inference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's very easy to. One of the dangers of the story is, I think I was actually commenting this in the chat last night during the book club discussion, is that having a good story that connects to our emotions, and even our emotions of outrage, even if it's not a story where you like the outcome. Sometimes I think having that, or even just having a story that seems to explain things clearly, makes you think, that's plausible. And then from that point on, you remember that as if that's the truth. And you forget that you didn't actually do any investigation or anything. You didn't actually check if it's really true that way. Yeah. And I think that there can be a danger in that. And I know I've certainly encountered things in nature and things in other areas, where it seemed plausible. And then what I remembered later was that was what was the case. because I could
that's
put
right.
a story together to remember it. And so I think, yeah, so it's good to keep in mind and to really to train ourselves to question those things as well.
Yeah, you know,
Another
just
thing
to I want to sort of just to tag on to that. You know, story is an incredibly powerful way to communicate. If you want to communicate with people and you do it through data, people's eyes will glaze over and they will not hear you. People remember the story. We are the ancestors of, hold on, a sneeze. Thank you. We're the ancestors of people who listen to the stories, and so learned from those. And the if a politician says, you know, that 43% of people, you know, are, you know, affected by this, and with confidence intervals of, you know, 10 points, whatever it is, nobody is going to listen to them. But if that same politician says, you know, Sally Jones lives in Minnesota, and here's what happened to her, right? Everybody can see that. We can identify with Sally. So we don't learn from data. We are primed to pay extra attention to stories. And so that's useful for us in communication, but it's also dangerous for us because a story is what scientists call an N of one, a sample size of one person. So it may be that did happen to Sally Jones, but for every one Sally Jones, there are 500 other people who a different thing happened to. But that story of Sally Jones is going to really resonate with us. So that's also one of the things that is discussed in our book club book about the impact of something being vivid and in story format and personalized. We remember that preferentially to things that are in the form of data. So, and what was your other thought?
But yeah, this is so great. So my other thought was, so I kind of sort of wrote my very quickly scribbled sort of simplified version of this just to kind of show my point here. Is that, so for the first two sort of lines that we're seeing in the flowchart, I felt that something that I would like to see is this sort of feedback loop. Something show so on the chain of you know, from questions to, you know, can it be answered by direct observation, to making observations, making provisional conclusions, so on, that I'd like to see that then either leading back to the beginning to questions, or maybe just, you know, because putting too many arrows in a flowchart makes it confusing, so figuring out how to make this visually sensible is tricky. But, you know, something that then shows that this is not the end of the story, showing that this is an ongoing process, and so we go, you know, back to ask another question. And same thing with the next line, you know, of you know, you know, finding explanations, that the could it be section, again with the questions. And part of that is that then the predictions part, you know, the coming up with possible explanations, making predictions, then you're investigating those. You are ideally what you are doing is you are coming up with new questions that can be addressed by direct observation.
Yes.
So having a line, because that's the whole point, right? Is if this explanation is correct, I would see this thing. So do I see this thing? And now
that is brilliant.
So
maybe repeat back to you what I think I just heard you say. And so you're saying that let's say you come to a conclusion. What you do at that point is you don't just sit on top of it and go like, I have made a conclusion. Hear me roar, right? I have made conclusion. And no, what you do is you go like, okay, so I now have this provisional conclusion. So I can do two things with that. I can test it and also use it as a source for other predictions. And so if this evidence is strong enough that I can give it provisional acceptance, then I can start to make other predictions from that. We're saying, well, if that's true, I would expect to see this and this and this and this and this. Now, if those other predictions are borne out by observations, then this becomes a very useful explanation. It doesn't mean it's true, but it's very useful. So it's able to generate a lot of predictions. So an explanation can then go back and make more. But if I'm finding that those predictions, but also each one of those new, if it's true, then I would also expect to see this. Those are also further tests of the phenomenon. So you're both testing and you're also then using it as a tool, because you're saying like, well, if it's true, we should expect to see this. I can now, from these predictions, kind of make other things happen. I love that feedback mechanism.
Yeah, well, and now I'm thinking of sort of like this idea of there is a sort of a hierarchy of questions that we're asking, where on the one hand there are very, very simple, very specific questions that are really just an excuse to make a certain kind of observation or do a certain experiment. And they are in service, they might be interesting on their own, but they can also be in service of higher level questions of, is this the explanation that I want? Okay, let me break that down and ask a bunch of small, simple questions about things I can observe in order to approach that larger question. So there's a sort of hierarchy, but then on the other hand, there's also, after I've done those experiments, there's coming back around to that, maybe that inspires new questions. There's also this option.
Conclusion. Explain this one to me.
Oh, well, there's a common joke where it will say, like, do something else, question mark, profit. So I'm just joking on the idea that you draw your conclusion and then you can sit on your throne and say, oh, I've made a conclusion and now I can profit from it. I'm just joking on that.
And I think that the profit of a conclusion that is useful is that you can make other predictions from it. So it becomes, its value is, if there is if there's an explanation that doesn't yield any real world testable predictions, in other words, is untestable, we can't tell if it's right or if it's wrong. We can't get anywhere closer to that. So sometimes there is, this is kind of an expression that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and it's useful to to make a point, but I also find that this next phrase is insulting to some people because, some of these untestable things, they may actually be true, right? We don't know, but it's just that they're not useful to us in science. So science isn't about finding truth. It's about finding the most useful explanation for the data which we have at hand. And by useful, I mean it's able to generate testable predictions that seem to work. So the expression that I think is, it's kind of fun, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I think it can also really rub people the wrong way. It's this idea of, they'll say, well, that explanation is not even wrong, right? Because something that's testable can be shown to be wrong. If something is completely untestable, then they say it's not even wrong because it's just this other thing you can't. So I kind of, it's a little bit flip, but especially when this gets into the realm of looking at people's, like deep-seated spiritual practice and beliefs, saying, well, your explanation, your hypothesis, it's not even wrong. It then really rubs them as pejorative. So I would not use that kind of language around things where people have an identity stake in the discussion. But the idea then, though, that a explanation is useful when you can use it to generate testable predictions. I think that your idea of the feedback loop can absolutely be incorporated into that model, and I like that. Let's bring on Kate Reiter into the conversation. And Susan, is it okay if I keep you on a little bit to see if there's anything that in case some of the things you were saying inspired things that you were saying, then you guys can bounce. I'm gonna add Kate to the spotlight. Hey there, Kate. Good to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. I guess so. I just wanted to make a comment from a graphic design sort of standpoint, because that's what I studied for a number of years. Can we bring it up as a share again?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Hold on a second. Here it is.
Because I think it was I was kind of thinking about Susan's idea. You said something about the hierarchy of questions. So when I was looking at it, two things that really stood out to me is one is kind of wanting a little bit more vertical alignment between things. And I know that's like a little tricky visually, but then also having more visual differentiation between like how important and necessary each one was, because you have kind of, yeah. So one of the things I noticed on here is like, we have observe and we have test. And for me, those are kind of in alignment and they also speak back and forth to each other, like this added, observing and testing.
Yeah.
And so having them so separate and also having them, being, so I guess and being also like the same like rectangle shape as the consider part, because the consider gets into kind of conclusions, like the observation is just something that you do and testing is something that you do, and then after that then you kind of do something different. So just kind of like thinking about how visually like you line everything up and how it what shapes that you're using to communicate different ideas, and being, trying to be really consistent about like, okay, this shape is for like conclusions, which is our third step, or, and this shape is for, because, exploring the question through poetry, story, philosophy, and spirituality, that feels to me in line with like testing and observing. And it talks all the way back and forth, the experience of like writing a story can come because of, like, I'm going to write a story about my observations. Like I write poetry based on like my experiences and, like direct things that I've observed and I've seen. And so that's like kind of that vertical conversation between those three actions, and then kind of having the conclusions. And I think that would also help visually, just saying like, when you have let it be, you're just not really making any final conclusions based on it. You're not, the understanding is inherent in that story or in that philosophy or any, like, that's kind of what it is. It's kind of in a different place. So yeah, that was just some things that I was thinking about. And also like, I understand. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty much it for the moment.
So we need more, sort of more parallel structure. So
yeah, more parallel structure, and then more kind of like size differentials of like, I would love to see this eventually if somebody was good at coding, is one of those like zoom in sort of things, because somebody was talking about, or I think Susan was talking about considering sample bias and sample size, like, you can be able to click on something and have it zoom in further, and kind of, so I would love to see a version of this that's really zoomed out. That's just kind of, and also, maybe a version with even simpler language, like elementary school language, that, like this would be super useful to be like, hey, here's this chart, this is what we're doing, and having it just be like really, like really simple language, really simple, just kind of simplified, and having that kind of vertical and horizontal alignment so that you understand where you are, what stage you're at, and whether, and then what you do next, like if this, then this, and then this. And then as you get older, you have like deeper layers of meaning and understanding. So yeah.
Oh, that is very, very useful. So we want more of a clear parallel structure. So elements like observe, test, and explore are visually connected up and down.
Those are the tasks that you
Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, and I was just thinking too, is if we could
Testing- sorry,
separate
the
out.
testing is kind of the making observations, right? So that's where the test kind of. Sorry, yeah.
No, yeah. Well, and I just was thinking now too, is that if we could separate explore out, so you have observe, test, and explore as like 3 separate options. And then, you know, so you know how you have provisionary explanations, you also have like, you know, you have poetry, you know, like those are kind of in that side of things. Like what you're actually doing with the information is like what you do with your observation is you consider sampling and then you have a provisionary conclusion. What you do with a deduction is that you test, you consider alternate explanations, and then you have an explanation at the end. And so, you know, when it's a let it be question, you kind of explore it, and then you go and you end up with a story or poetry or new, you know, or comment on your spirituality. Just an idea, just to like.
Yes. And I wonder if one of the actions under the let it be is to create.
Yeah, maybe instead of explore, it's create, you know? I mean, making art, like, I mean, Eleni talks a lot about like art, like art therapy. That's kind of in that realm of just like, you know, of creating. And then from there, you know, then you end up, or, you know, exploring or whatever, you know, that you have kind of this element of these things that are not quite knowable, not quite observable, not quite explanation, but it's a different way of knowing, and it's a different way of understanding the world, really.
Yeah, I think that to understand that it is a different way of knowing and understanding the world, and it is still a legitimate way of understanding the world, even though it is not science, but it is still a legitimate way of exploring and encountering this world, and giving respect and credit to that doesn't diminish these other paths for exploring the world, and it doesn't confuse people about the nature of science. Yeah. Okay, that is very helpful, and again, those are things I can directly incorporate into this. All right, Avea, let's bring you into this.
Hello.
Hello there. Oh wait, hold on. I think you're.
I'm okay now. Sorry, I might have accidentally muted myself again. So I wanted to build off of something that Katie just mentioned, that Susan had said in the chat about biases. Susan had mentioned perhaps having part of the flowchart go off into what biases, so that way we can start to sort of like having not quite a checklist, but almost one, because it might help to think about what some of the most common biases are that we encounter in the scientific process. And I know that part of it's helped a lot by the the Psychology of Intelligence analysis book that we're reading. As you can see, we're fans. So that could be helpful. And so I was trying to write down some of the ones that I thought might come up, like possibly confirmation bias, availability.
Wait, hold on. Yeah, we need the.
Just arrived today.
All right. We're not putting pressure on everybody to get this, but you might want to check this out. And then, so for folks who don't know, this is a declassified CIA document. Yep. And it's about how we think and make decisions, and kind of can go off the rails in our kind of explanations for things. And it takes a bunch of kind of psychological research, and is really drilling into what is really relevant if you're making high stakes decisions, or even low stakes decisions about like, why does that pattern form in the river?
Yeah. Plus, we have good conversations about blue and gold dresses.
That's right. We went there.
So possibly having almost like the way that we do a Y web, except it could be a bias web. So that way we leave room for other biases, but maybe just like listing the most common 4 or 5 biases that we encounter in the scientific process, or even fewer if we don't want to make the flowchart too much like too detailed or whatever. So even just having the most common ones, almost like a troubleshooting guide. So like I mentioned, there's confirmation bias. I think that's probably the one you called the mother of all cognitive biases.
That's right.
There's availability heuristic. There's like, I was writing it down. There's false cause fallacy, the whole post hoc ergo propter hoc one. There's hasty generalization, which I guess relates to sample size. And this isn't going to be part of the flow chart, but it might also be good at another point to think about how to test for each of the biases, because we can hear about them, but then how do you actually go through testing to see if you are suffering the biases? But again, that's not part of the flow chart. And then I had,
can I comment on one thing there? Is that some of those biases I think connect naturally to different parts of the flow chart. Because, for example, the things like sampling bias and things like that are directly connected with, I'm making my observations, I'm taking my samples, I'm gathering my data, but I'm doing it in a way that's convenient to me, that is not getting a representative sample of data. There's other biases that are involved in, like, what kinds of explanations can I think of, or what testable predictions am I making by those explanations, and those are more cognitive biases. And so I'm not quite sure how to fit that into the flowchart, right? But it's interesting to note that I think that they do sort of connect naturally to different parts of the process. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, I think.
So perhaps then perhaps what we can do is we can look at if there is a way to kind of, this bias web is a useful idea, and perhaps it fits into this, or perhaps it doesn't. But if it doesn't, then it definitely deserves a place in some future educators' forums as a source of some deep geeking out.
I also
I didn't mean to interrupt what you were saying, Ivea. Please carry on. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. I'm also seeing that Kate has a visual that she uses quite a bit in her research work, the Cognitive Bias Codex, a visual. So I'm going to have to check that out in a moment. Another thing that I'd begun wondering about because of our conversation was, are there different kinds of biases for each of the different kinds of questions that are more like, do we encounter certain biases more with let's see questions, or certain ones more with could it be questions? So like, for example, with availability heuristic, one thing that I like to think about when it comes to could it be questions is that if it results in a why web, then it's a pretty good chance you've got a could it be question. And so, for example, when we have, can we think of possible plausible explanations, I did a little icon of a why web next to it. And so maybe having a few more of these icons near some of the things, like I noticed that you had the microscope and some other things like that. And so then I was going on the noun project to try to think like, what is a good way of trying to illustrate that one. And so I found this one on the noun project, and then this one. Sometimes it's just kind of nice to have the little icons to go, but that might be too much. I'm not really sure, but just from a sketchnoting perspective, that's kind of fun. You get the idea. And so those were just, sorry, I think that was pretty much it. It's just the idea of having a bias web.
I like it, and it may fit into this, or as Susan was suggesting, that it may be that those different biases sneak in different places, and it might just kind of clutter up this flow chart. But I think that we do want to have some future educators forums where we kind of blast into some of these biases. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
I had a thought relating to this idea of fitting into the flowchart, which is, and somebody had mentioned the sort of idea of kind of zooming in on different things, and I think keeping in mind what Kate was saying about the graphic design and the readability, and especially if different groups of people are going to be seeing this flowchart who have different levels of knowledge. I mean, obviously, if you're talking to kindergartners, you're going to want to modify that and make it something that is going to be simple and easy for them to understand. If you're talking to adults with a science background, you're going to do something different. But what I'm thinking is perhaps in the interest of making it readable, understandable, I'm a big fan of sort of having processes and sub-processes. I study computer science a bit. This is what we're always doing, is you're always, your program that does these three things, but the three things are actually calling these 3 subroutines that each do a bunch of things to solve, and each of those is doing this. And so you're breaking the problem down in a very modular way. So what I'm thinking is that you can have a sort of a simple, big picture version of the flow chart, which is doing what Kate was suggesting of having, these different types of questions and getting to that point of observation, and then the conclusion, test, conclusion, write poetry, etc., create things, whatever it is, right? But then you can zoom in on that part and zoom in on the part about this sort of, expand this to have a new flow chart of what are we talking about when we have observation, direct observation, collecting samples, different kinds of things, what kinds of biases open up, we have our bias web, all those different things, how to draw conclusions and how to understand the strength of your, how you can get as deep into that as you want to, right? The strength of your conclusions and how certain they are, it's same thing for the testable hypotheses, again, like what kinds of biases, bias web, how does that affect these? And you can get into much greater detail about these things. And I think you've done that, I think, is what you were showing us earlier, which I remember you showing us at one of the Nature Journal Club Thursday sessions about, asking questions and drawing these conclusions. And you had this example of the American robin and all these different possible explanations and what kinds of predictions. So that, I think, is an example of the kind of zooming in and looking at that in greater detail. So it might just be a matter of sort of thinking about the structure of this as like you have the big picture that's pretty straightforward and clear and has that kind of, that's sort of like parallel, things like you were suggesting, and then getting into the details, and that's where what Udvay is saying comes in, perhaps.
The other thing is that I wanted to go back to something that you had said, Susan, about working in some of the checks for the biases within the flowchart itself. So like, for example, with the whole hasty generalization, under the part where it says consider sample size, that already sort of addresses that one, because it's asking you to consider the size of your sample. And so then, like when we say, can we think of possible plausible explanations, then, but then later on it says consider alternate explanations and assumptions, then that's already beginning to question like the ability. I think I'm using it right when I say availability heuristic, unless I'm getting it mixed up with a different bias. But then that's already, saying, it's already sort of implying there, make sure that you're not just jumping on the first possible explanations, make sure that you're including a lot of, room to expand your Y web, so to speak. And so then with the whole false cause fallacy, I'm wondering if there might be like a key question to somehow put into, like, even as a bullet point and within the flowchart to make sure that we're not like attributing the wrong significance because of order of events, like just simply knowing what the key questions would be to test for each of these, and then finding a way to sneak it into this chart might be a good way of going as well. So like consider alternate explanations and assumptions. I don't know, like I feel like there's some way I could help tweak that to make it so that we're making sure that we're not just saying that because this happened and we observed it first, then it didn't mean that this happened second, and not making assumptions. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense. So that this, and I like this kind of idea of like there's maybe kind of the big picture graphic helps you see the structure, and then some way of zooming in on these little areas where we can deal with these things, such as these different biases and ways to kind of combat them. Let's bring in another Kate to the discussion. Kate Chandler is joining us from the horse ranch. As Spotlight. Hello there. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. This has been a really interesting discussion. I've just mostly been listening while working on some stuff. I think one of the things I wanted to add into that was in relation to, I forget where I heard this, but I was listening to something the other day while I was painting. I was talking about how the way we interpret information. It was talking about like with the pandemic and whatnot, when a lot of the media that we're exposed to wants a definitive answer right away, and it's often not how science works. And there's really value in experts for those big questions, because something we may not be able to like directly observe and whatnot, being able to interact with like science at a higher level is really helpful for our understanding, and even just asking these simple questions and learning how to navigate those questions in a way that like relates to how that specific thing works is really important. And I think especially for interacting with like middle school, high school, college age and above, one thing you can do, especially in this day and age, is say like, hey, here's how you look for answers through people. Because I feel like a lot of scientists and stuff are actually pretty open to having those conversations, and being able to like to find those answers with researchers who have access to like the kind of observation that maybe you can't do on a personal level, and being able to initiate that conversation and then interpret that in a way that's like legible to you.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I love that you just brought that up, because that's exactly what we've been reading about in the in the psychology of intelligence analysis, about how much, oh God, yes.
Oh, you guys are making me feel bad. We have to get this book or something.
It's not meant to be pressure, but
Sure.
what you just said about pressure to have a definitive answer, this book says something to the effect that analysts are oftentimes pressured to have definitive answers early because public wants information, and that's also a problem, because when you have really unclear information at that point, if you commit too much to an answer early, it becomes harder for your brain to be flexible later to change its mind, and that in the face of new evidence, in the face of new information. And so even if analysts can train themselves to overcome that, the public might still be latching on to that very first answer. And because they want the conclusion, because we like conclusions, we like feeling like the ground is stable under our feet. And so I just love that you brought that up, because that's exactly what we're talking about. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh, totally. That, and then being able to like have some sort of trust in sort of the institutions of science and like people who are peer reviewed. That means that they have like committed to doing their research in a certain way that like has credibility. And like it kind of relates to something I'm doing, where I work on my first like scientific illustration project that I hope to get published. And I'm working with my friend who's a herpetologist, and we initially started with, oh, I'll just do the write-ups, you do the illustrations. And now I'm trying to do two-toed amphimas from photos. Thing is, people don't take a lot of don't take a lot of photos of two-toed amphimas. And so trying to look at like direct observation through the photos we do have on iNaturalist and all kinds of stuff, I felt like I was coming up kind of short, because I had never seen one of these in person. But my friend he carries around all kinds of herps and knows them intimately. So it became a thing of like drawing drafts and going, okay, Parker, what does this look like? And if you saw me laughing at things randomly early in the call, it's because we were having back and forths of sketches with reduce the toe nubbins by about 2/3, it should be about, what was it, 25 less chunk, which, yeah, very scientific language. It gets the point across. But yeah.
But isn't that interesting? Like when we get something out of our head and onto paper, then all of a sudden this other person can look at it and give us feedback on it. And that's one of the powers of visualization and drawing and sketching using the pictures to do stuff, is that or if you've ever like started to say an idea and partway through your idea you're like, okay, no, scratch that. That doesn't make sense. But when it's sitting just up in your electric meat, it sounds really good.
Mm-hmm.
I also love what you were saying there. Science is about uncertainty, and if you can't handle uncertainty, then you're not cut out for doing science. And changing your mind in the presence of evidence. If you're not comfortable doing that, don't do science, right? Yeah. And exactly what you're saying, like the public wants a confident statement from somebody who looks like they're a person of authority, and they want it fast. And the first evidence that we get about stuff in a confused, chaotic landscape is the stuff that is most likely to be wrong and to change later. So right at the start, when people are wanting, just give me answers. If we don't understand the process of science, then we get mad at Fauci for changing the COVID protocols. Like, you were saying this before, and now you're saying something different.
Yeah.
For us to go like, oh, you would expect that if the person who's making these statements is continuing to collect data. You would expect those things to change because of the law of small numbers.
Yeah. Well, that in the case of like, that's the weird thing looking at like science policy. On one hand, you have people who are expecting answers and direction because as much as people like to oppose government, a lot of times that's the first place we look for. Something's gone wrong. What do we do? And people like definitive answers because they're comforting.
Yeah.
And
On that, I'm going to read you a quote drawn from the Psychology of Intelligence Analysis
oh boy.
from Voltaire.
Oh dear.
Oh yeah. Are you ready? Here it comes. Buckle your seatbelt, dear friends. Doubt is not a pleasant state, but certainty is a ridiculous one. Right? Certainty, but the more certain somebody looks, the more we're likely to elect them.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's just another psychological hardware thing. I mean, I've noticed like in my interactions with other people, like especially whenever I'm with a group of people in elements like somewhere outdoors where I'm very comfortable and they're new to things, you can immediately just go, oh yes, this is how it works, follow me. And they go, oh, you're the leader. Well, you just assume that because you think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah. This is fun. And see, this is the stuff that we're also starting to get into in the reading group.
Yeah.
Isn't this cool? Hey, let's bring in Lindy, and also I see Jim has something to share. Let's first bring in Lindy here. Oh boy. Oh, actually, first I want to check back in with you, Kate. Did you get a chance to share all the points that were on your brain?
I had one more thing.
Oh, please.
Back
Okay.
to Voltaire. So I thought it was really interesting they brought Voltaire because the late 18th century was a really crazy time for science because people were starting to create like scientific infrastructure, which had some really positive and negative effects. But the whole idea of shifting from, there was like two big social movements happening, which was like one of scientific observation becoming like a way of accepting fact. The other thing that was happening was people questioning, monarchies and theocratic governments, which is crazy because you go from a society that accepts these certainties to these two huge social movements that completely move away from that, like, oh, these things are certain. It's like, well, there are other ways of gaining truth aside from I guess that magisterium worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
what a
that's
cool
right.
time.
The what we call the argument from authority, that take this as truth because I said so, as opposed to here's the evidence for a claim.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Kate.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Right. So we're bringing Lindy in on the conversation. Lindy, thank you so much for being with us, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year, everyone. I love this topic so much because I work a lot with teachers and like talking about scientific literacy and what that entails when we foster that for our students. And a main component of that is fostering a healthy sense of skepticism and being able to hold ambiguity and like room for that in science, which people don't often associate with science necessarily if they haven't been taught that way. So I love this conversation. I'm going to bring up just two things that came to mind really quickly when I was like kind of going through this flow chart. One of them, Kate already brought up, Kate Chandler just kind of talked about this, but I think about going from developing a question to, can it be directly observed or researched? And I think in many times when you're in the classroom, you just don't have access to the types of tools that are available elsewhere to observe, like Kate was saying. And so I think being able to have that as an option that students can find, I know this isn't just for young students, but like that any of us can find reliable sources to research the question and maybe find a hole in that data that we want to fill through further observation. But I think that's kind of an important avenue that you can, it's also kind of a let's see, but it's a different way of seeing. You know, you might be looking at a book or an online resource that you trust, or going directly to an expert who has that knowledge. And then the other thing that I would add specifically for use in the classroom, but I think it's helpful for everyone, is often students generate questions that are close to being testable, but aren't quite, because they might have like ill-defined terms, or, you know, just kind of are ambiguous. Like there's a little bit of hyperbole in their question or something like that, that if they just modify their question slightly, we could turn it into a testable or researchable question. And so I think like having that avenue as well, because sometimes the question is very close to being a testable, researchable, observable question, but it's not quite there just because they might use, you know, one or two terms that, you know, make that really difficult to test for. So I think, you know, having that avenue of like, is this question testable? Well, if it isn't, can we easily modify it to make it testable? Can we define one of our terms, or can we, you know, like make a little tweak?
So how can you modify it? Like I once saw somebody who was doing this teacher education program, and what they're trying to do is, if anybody asked any let's see questions, they tried, I mean, could it be questions? They tried to get them to turn them all into let's see questions. And I know you're not saying that. I really like that idea of, you know, can you tweak that question to make it testable or observable without changing it into a question, a different question?
Right. Like you might have a student that says like, do squirrels live with their families or something like that? And it's like, yeah, we can probably like figure out if squirrels are staying with the same squirrels. We might not have the scope to like observe if these were the same squirrels that birthed them and like they're all actually related. We're not like DNA testing the squirrels, but like we could tag the squirrels maybe and like observe specific traits about them and see if they're like consistently nesting together or something. Like we could just modify that like slightly to make it a little bit more specific, and then we could get there.
That's really, really useful, and also I think it's very doable in the flow chart. And what you're saying about research, it also would be useful to have that in there. And with that, you then get into having them the same thing. What is the strength of the evidence for a claim you're finding in the research? Just as what is the strength for a claim that you are finding in the in your own observations or research?
Right, like thinking about meta-analyses, like you are literally just doing science with a bunch of research articles. Like you're just taking a bunch of different things that other people have tested and compiling them together and then doing tests with that data set. So it's a different type of research. It's not necessarily observation, I would say, but it's you know, it's still testing your hypotheses.
And for these kind of sort of send them down the rabbit hole of trying to get to the primary source for a claim. And so directing people towards some of the original journal articles, perhaps, that a claim is based on. and also looking at the credibility of the source of the information. And right now, there's lots of sources of information that have ideological, very powerful ideological biases. And then they're filtering how information is presented. And so to have that also be when people are looking at, when they're doing research, looking at just not just what the evidence is for a claim, but I think it is also then relevant, not that you want to do the, that you're, poisoning the well, that, you can't trust this information because it came from this source, but the sources of information are still really relevant for figuring out what's going on, because these days, again, we can find sources of information that are intentionally deceptive and consistently so. Avea.
Quick thing, in case anybody's hearing all of all of these logical fallacy terms and a bit confused because there's so many of them, highly recommend this book. It's an illustrated guide to the logical fallacies. So if people are hearing all of these and want to understand more what we're talking about, I'm not sure where poisoning the well is in here, but like, for example, false dilemma, and then they have a nice little cartoon here. And so if anybody would like a guide, I just wanted to recommend this book before we continue.
I got that for the for my girls, and at your recommendation, and put it out next to the toilet, so that they, each little logical fallacy is something that they can get through in the few minutes that they're in there, and it is they've then come out of the bathroom asking me questions about a particular logical fallacy. So that book is working for us.
Very cool. And thank you. And I'm sorry to interrupt. Because I wanted to make sure that people understand, I understand that logical fallacies, there's a lot of terms, and thank you.
I like to point out Aisha's comment that they can flush away logical fallacies. It's a much more polite way of saying what I was thinking.
So just bumping back to you, Lindy, were there other thoughts or ideas that you had? This is very useful, practical stuff.
Yeah, I think those were the main ones, I would say, apart from, what is already a really useful structure. So thank you.
Lindy, tell us a little bit about your background. What are you doing you've got a foot deeply in science communication, it seems.
Yeah, I was a teacher for 16 years, classroom teacher. And then I went back to school recently to get my master's, and I'm getting it in cognitive science and education. So I study a lot of psychology stuff. If I had that book, I'd whip it out right now. But I actually wrote it down, so maybe I'll get it.
Yeah, and join us on the book club. We've just had the first meeting of the book club. It's Tuesday night.
Is it weekly or monthly?
It's a weekly book club right now.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna look into that. But yeah, so I do educational research, and my main area of interest is in inquiry learning, and what are the processes involved with scientific reasoning? How do students come to these different experiences, and how can we as teachers scaffold those experiences for students so that they can develop functional scientific literacy? So kind of working in that realm. And I also do a lot of work with discourse, which is contained within, scientific inquiry and things like that. So yeah. Thanks.
So by the way, Lindy, as you're kind of doing this research, if you come up with topics that you think we should use in our Educators Forum, please let us know. And if you want to present to us some of your research or things that you're finding, we would love to give you that forum. Really like your
well, actually, a few of the Educator Forum participants did help me out with a brief study that I did about creativity and science. And I used nature journaling to look at that, and I had some really interesting findings. So I would love to share that with you guys at some point.
Hey, let's do that. Let's do that. Shoot me an email and we'll get that on the books.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, speaking of
Yes, please.
for conversational stuff like that, what's the best email to use to contact you? Because I know you have several. I was looking through my email threads trying to figure out which one was the best way to get a hold of you.
So to go hold of you for me or Lindy?
Oh, sorry, for you.
For me.
Yes.
So you can use John Muir Laws at johnmuirlaws.com. Or if you ever forget, you just go to my website, which is johnmuirlaws.com. And there is a contact link there, and you can click on that, and it has my email listed there. There's also a form that you can send an email through the computer if you don't want to use your own email. And it's also got my telephone number there. So if you want to give me a call and say hi, we can talk.
Okay. I think I do have your phone number somewhere. But yeah, okay. I will shoot you an email.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Hey, Jim, thank you so much for waiting. Let's bring Jim Van Gelder into the conversation. I'm going to, now you can unmute. Oops, let's try it again. Wait, we still are blocked. Try to unmute again. We're still.
I was hitting the wrong button.
Oh, there he is.
There we go.
That works much better. Yeah, I'm on a different computer. I was going to start out with an observation which is so obvious that I kind of hesitated to mention it. I'm sure it's something that's been covered before, but I'm going to go a little further on it. And the observation is that, of course, all either of the first two chains on the flowchart can end at any time in the final one for let it be. With, all of these things are, of course, fodder for poetry, story, philosophy, or spirituality, which is really obvious. And I'm sure that's, I'm kind of coming in late on this.
Well, no. But I think it needs to be articulated, because if kids are thinking that if it's an observational thing, I can't write a poem about it.
Well, yeah, if you're doing this chart for kids or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
But the proposition that I have, and I haven't really thought it out yet, but it seems that the further you go down the first two flowcharts, the less you're going to get out, or the harder it becomes to go into the explore the question through poetry, story, philosophy, or spirituality. Or maybe not harder, but the less it's done. I'm just kind of thinking of like, well, if I was going to go out and do a painting, take my watercolors out to a painting, and I sit down on a log and I can do a landscape. But one of the things that I always kind of get into is decomposition. I like to kind of look at what's going on, the mosses, and then you pull that off, and then there's the decaying leaves, and then there's another layer of mycelium, and that's hard to do a real painting of. Maybe it's not harder, but it's rarely done. But I think it's a really fruitful, avenue. Or just birds. Like, yeah, you see a lot of paintings of birds, but you don't see many paintings that are about, or works of art that are about bird behavior. And just a larger thing of, I think there's a lot of illustration in science, but I see very little melding of art and science. So maybe these are fields that are yet to be explored. But, and I don't know how that can work into the flowchart. I've been kind of trying to get my head around that, but I can't think about it. There's too much other conversation going on. But Anyway, those were just my thoughts.
And that's right. I think that, so you're pointing out to us that if we just have that nugget at the end as something you do with the let it be's, then people think that that is just for the let it be's. Those are things that can be plugged in anywhere in any experience, and that makes the world richer.
Mhm.
And if we, perhaps the more we go down an analytical route, if we feel that that's what I'm supposed to be doing in that place, then I'm kind of shutting myself off from being present with the poetry of the moment.
I don't know if you're necessarily shutting yourself off. I think it just makes it harder to, as I say, it's hard to do a real fine art painting about mycelium, or again, these are thoughts that I'm just coming up with on the fly. Generally, in terms of literature, this is where you end up with like just so stories, you know. I mean, there is maybe science and art are non-overlapping magisteria. Possibly.
Oh, let me bring out a book from over here on my shelf. I'm walking.
Can I also ask a question to you, Jim? Would you consider diagrams to be sort of an overlapping point between art and science?
I think diagrams have a lot of potential. You know, it's something I think that doesn't really get explored.
Yeah, the idea that we can, that our analysis of something, if I kind of get locked into that framework, it can impair my ability to think or to find the art and beauty in something. This is a book called The Unfeathered Bird, and it is these
It's a great book.
These studies of skeletons of birds, and it is visually stunning, and is this wonderful, scientific investigation of anatomy of these things, but is also done with this with an eye to just sort of the wonder and the beauty of what is around us. I think that we can, if we choose to, we can find the beauty in, I think of science as inherently sort of an investigation of wonder and beauty, but sometimes our process can take us out of a connection with that.
Right, it's easy to forget that, you can also make it beautiful if you're.
That's right. Yeah, when I was doing my master's thesis, at one point I just sort of got so deep into the statistics of it in the middle of a Montana winter, and the process just sucked the life out of me, and I wasn't doing it in a way that maintained my the joy and wonder of being alive. Let me read just a quick poem, and this is it's about analyzing something, and there are there are different ways of doing it, and it's by Billy Collins, and the poem is called Introduction to Poetry. And so he teaches at a university and teaches people. how to write poems. And so he says, I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is to tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So I really like your invitation to, at any point along this, to also to be in the beauty of it, to go water ski with your phenomenon. Avea? Yes.
I wanted to quickly mention something that Jim brought up earlier in the chat as well. And I also see your hand to Eleni, that earlier Jim was mentioning this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Danielle Kahneman. You were mentioning, I believe, a chapter about small numbers. Is that right?
Yeah, the law of small numbers, which he's got a great chapter on that in there. And you find it applies a lot in the world.
I wanted to maybe suggest that once we're done with the CAA document, if we're continuing, maybe this could be one of the contenders for one of our next books.
That's a really fun one.
I just wanted to say too, before I jump off, I may have overstated my case because I see there's a lot of stuff coming in, chatter on the chat, that when I say I have not experienced that much of a melding of science and art, I have a limited perspective, you know. I don't mean to imply that there isn't any. It's just there might be a lot that I haven't run across, or it might just not be something that I find to my taste, possibly too.
Or perhaps to the little graduate student that was myself years ago, sitting in that dark little room in Montana, to be intentional about going out and finding that art as you know, to play in that space intentionally. And sometimes if we are, you know, too deep into just perhaps measuring something, we may lose track of that, and we try to, in my case, tie the lazuli bunting to the chair. Yeah, James, thank you so much. Let's bring Eleni back in, and then in just a moment we will be wrapping up this discussion. This has been a very, very interesting and productive discussion. I wanted to thank everybody so much for engaging with us.
Yeah. Wow, what a great conversation. So maybe I'll just say something briefly that's kind of personal. When I was, you know, in school, I loved science and I loved art, and I loved both of them. And I think I was just this sort of oddball person. And I still love science and I still love art. And because I want to be whole, I don't want them to be in contradiction.
Yeah.
And so it occurs to me that so much of our conversation, it's actually this evening over here, but this afternoon or lunchtime over there, so much is developmental. I think that when we're teaching kids, or maybe teaching anybody, we need to sort of maybe put stuff in a box to make it kind of clear. But at the end of the day, all that beginner's mind is in science, and beginner's mind is in art, and all the beauty of order is in science and it's in art. And those those big principles have been the things that I've loved my whole life, science and art. And so it's sort of those meta concepts in a way that have them feel the same to me. They feel the same. They feel that they're inquiries into life, inquiries to how things work and how things are structured. And to me, as someone who, you know, is a serious artist, or that, whatever that means, or a teaching artist and a dabbler in science, it hurts to put them in an argument with each other.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of personal poetical side of things. At the same time, I think we all have a lot of work to do and I love that Jack, you shared with us, you know, that model of the three things of the, you know, direct observation, inference, and things that really just get answered elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a great conversation. I really appreciate that you've provided a context for it, and I just really enjoyed every contribution. It's sort of expanded my mind and my heart.
You know, I find the same thing. These conversations through the Educators Forum, we have opportunities to probe ideas that make us better educators and make us better people. And I don't find a lot of other places where that is happening in my world right now. So that's why I really look forward to these Wednesdays with all of you.
Yeah.
You know, we're, you know, here embedded in this savage and delicate and beautiful world. And we can appreciate its beauty, we can appreciate its intricacy, and the more that we pay attention, the richer this life becomes. All of these are tools to attention. So in our nature journaling, we're drawing pictures, we're making diagrams, we're counting things, we're measuring things, we're making graphs, we're writing poems, we're doing all these sorts of things. And if we get the idea that there's a way I'm supposed to be doing it, that like, oh, my nature journal isn't as scientifically angled as that other person's over there, it's okay. Yours is going to look like yours and theirs is going to look like theirs. And however you're doing this, whatever brings you alive, that's what you want to be doing. And if that helps you just be present and celebrate this incredible experience that we're just so lucky to be able to engage in, then it's of use.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your participation in this. I want to bring on my two other co-hosts also. Everybody, let's give it up for the Billy Joe and Avea Moore. And for everyone in our community, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your participation in these discussions. Oh, Avea's got another little nugget for us.
It's specifically for you, Eleni. It's a comic from Birding is My Favorite Video Game by the incredible Rosemary Mosca. I'll try to put this as close as I can. So we have science and art fighting with each other. And then we have some folks off to the side. This looks like it might take a while. Want to grab some coffee? Okay. And therefore they walk off and science and art is love. Just because you were saying about science and art fighting. They don't have to.
That's right.
And that maybe it takes us back to that very first place, like what kinds of stories. Let's leave the high stakes stories out for the moment. Yeah. But what kinds of stories can then give us new ideas that we want to then interrogate using, you know, scientific method, and then how scientific method can lead to amazing imagination about possibility. So yeah.
And I think that that is the perfect thought to end this discussion on. Thank you so much, dear friends. Thank you all. Be kind, be well, and let's do our best in this beautiful world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay.